Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them.
So they're making that case, and a watching world is looking at it and saying, okay, well, these people are claiming Trump and MAGA and the MAGA ethic as a Christian ethic, and I don't want anything to do with that. If that's the price of admission, count me out. And the people who don't believe that, who see things differently, almost to a person, are staying silent. So there's no counter narrative.
Recent death of Charlie Kirk, we've seen sort of a split within evangelicalism highlighted because how people responded to the death of Charlie Kirk has become sort of a marker for one's faith among some people. So we've heard stories already of how folks are saying, leave your church if your pastor didn't say anything about the death of Charlie Kirk, which seems odd for a faith that's called Christianity, not Kirkianity. But we've heard stories already of pastors who have dealt with that firsthand in their congregations, with people just very distraught and upset because their pastor didn't talk about the death of Charlie Kirk the Sunday after the murder happened. And then, of course, we saw that memorial service. That's where two different versions of Christianity were on display, seeming, I think for the folks there, seeming to be like one version of Christianity as far as they could tell. So my guest today, to help me kind of make sense of what's going on and help to process what's taking place within churches today and in response to the Charlie Kirk Memorial and also other things that are going on. My guest today is Pete Wehner. He was formerly a speechwriter for George W. Bush and a senior fellow at the Ethics and Policy Center, and now is a contributing writer for The Atlantic. Pete Wehner, thanks for joining the AVC podcast.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and you wrote this one piece for The Atlantic that we'll share. We already shared it in our newsletter. We'll share it in the podcast description as well. So just give us some of your thoughts on what you saw as you observed reactions to the murder of Charlie Kirk, and then also this memorial service.
Yeah, in terms of the memorial service, it was pretty striking. At least the moment that I focused in on the essay, and that striking moment was when Charlie Kirk's widow, Erica, spoke, and she forgave the person who had assassinated her husband, and she did it through tears. So it's a very poignant moment. It was clear that Christianity, as she understands Christianity, was pretty central to her life, and gave her the courage to be able to say that she forgave the person who killed her husband and the father of her children. So that was moving. It was moving testimony to a lot of people who were Christians and non-Christians. Then a few minutes later, Donald Trump came up, and he was reading a tribute, which was based on a script that some speechwriters had done for him. But then he went off script when he was acknowledging that Charlie Kirk didn't hate his opponents, and Trump went out of his way and said, "Well, that's where I disagree with Charlie. I hate my opponents." And then he sort of wink and a nod says, "Sorry, Erica," to the widow. What was notable to me was that in that stadium with about 100,000 people, many of whom would claim to be followers of Jesus, probably the vast majority of them, they were very moved, and they stood up and applauded Erica Kirk when she said what she said. And at the same time, again, just a few minutes later, when Donald Trump said what he said, they cheered too, and they laughed, and Trump gave them sort of a knowing smile. And so I used that moment as a way to dilate on what I thought was happening within the evangelical and the fundamentalist world as it relates to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. And so that's really what the essay was an effort to explore. And I looked at what I thought were two representative samples of the evangelical movement. One are hyper MAGA churches, people composed of the so-called theobros. And there, the ethic of Trump is the ethic of the church: aggression, cruelty. Owning the libs is the biggest charge that people can get in their weekly life. Trying to irritate the progressive movement, and for people like that, it's pretty simple. Trump represents the ethic that they do. And that's a pretty large group of people. I'd say it's particularly pronounced in the fundamentalist world, but also increasingly in the evangelical world. And I also think that there's a fusion happening between evangelicalism and fundamentalism, that evangelical doctrine is now being twinned with fundamentalist sensibilities. It's its own interesting topic because, of course, evangelicalism in the 20th century really broke with fundamentalism. And now I think you're seeing the reconvergence of the two. But then the other group that I had in mind were people who attend church, conservative evangelical churches that aren't hyper-political, aren't hyper-MAGA, and yet many people within those churches are Trump supporters, are MAGA supporters, and trying to understand what it is, because it's such a puzzle to, I think, so many people on how folks who can profess to be followers of Jesus indeed claim that that's the number one thing in their life, the most central thing in their life, and yet at the same time embrace a man whose ethic is almost perfectly antithetical to Jesus. So that's what I tried to do in the essay.
Yeah, and I think this is a very key point for folks who are listening, who you have friends or family members who you're concerned about because they're gone down this authoritarian rabbit hole based upon their social media, whether it's the algorithms or the podcasters they're listening to or whatever it is, and you're concerned about them, right? And so there's like three paragraphs in this essay I just want to read for my listeners, because I think it's such an important point for folks to understand. You wrote, quote, "Every Sunday, millions of Christians attend churches that are non-denominational and that are affiliated with conservative Protestant denominations. These churches aren't particularly political, and they are led by pastors who preach thoughtfully on topics such as loving your enemy and turning the other cheek, which Jesus talked about during his Sermon on the Mount, and verses like this one found in the book of Ephesians, written by the Apostle Paul. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you." The great majority of people attending these churches wouldn't consider those verses to be woke talking points. They would view them as the inerrant word of God. They would earnestly pray that those words would sanctify their life and that they would become more like Jesus. And almost to a person, these congregates would say that Christ is at the center of their life, their, quote, all in all. Yet, many of them will spend part of the rest of the week, and maybe much of the rest of the week, in the right-wing echo chamber in the company of conflict entrepreneurs, having their emotions inflamed, feeling the same way toward their enemies as Donald Trump does toward his enemies. And it will all make perfect sense to them. So I think the important point there, it's a point I've tried to make many other times, is that the split that we're seeing between like MAGA Christianity and confessional Christianity, whatever you want to call it, this split doesn't just represent two groups on Twitter. The split goes through individuals. People themselves are being split, and by this split that's happening.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's too easy to make sweeping generalizations in this discussion, like in many discussions. And people are complicated, situations are complicated, and so when one is looking at what's driving evangelical Christians in the political arena in this moment, particularly as it relates in American politics, Trump and the MAGA movement. You have to distinguish what's going on. In some cases, people are doing it for cynical reasons. They're doing it for reasons of ambition and power and money. Those would be the conflict entrepreneurs, members of Congress, members of his cabinet, people who know better, but are doing what they're doing because they see a vested interest. They know which way the political winds are blowing. So there are those people, but there are also people who, if you gave them sodium pentothal and asked, they would say, yeah, Donald Trump, maybe he's imperfect, but he represents what we think Christianity should stand for in this moment in the political, cultural sphere. And they believe net that he's doing good, often a huge amount of good, and that he is the personification of what they want in a president. Not necessarily, a number of them wouldn't argue that Trump is particularly a moral person, though I found in my conversations with him, they tend to dramatically underplay just the maliciousness and the malevolence and the corruption of his character. They wouldn't go as far as they should, but they said, look, he's not perfect. But he doesn't have to be perfect. We're electing a president, not a pastor, and he's prosecuting the case that we want. He's advancing the values that we want. He's promoting the common good in ways that we think are appropriate, and therefore we're going to stick with him. And oh, by the way, he has all the right enemies. There was a line that they unfurled a banner in the 1930s at a Democratic convention. I think it was the 1932 convention for Theodore Roosevelt. The banner said, "We love you for the enemies you've made." And I think for a lot of Christians, their allegiance to Donald Trump is driven in part by the sense that we love you for the enemies that you have made. You irritate, upset, horrify all the right people. So that group is a little more complicated to sort through and to understand. Even though at the end of the day, I think that they're part of a movement that's doing grave damage to the American project and to Christianity itself.
So is there, what would be the role of, like, if you're at a church, maybe you're the pastor or you're a small group leader or ministry leader, and you have folks in your church, like you're talking about, that, they come and hear like a nonpartisan gospel on Sundays, and then they enter the right-wing echo chambers the rest of the week. Is there anything that churches can do in this circumstance?
In the short term, probably not. I think this took a lot of years to develop. I think there was probably a failure of catechesis, a failure on a lot of different fronts on the part of churches and on the part of Christians. I don't want to put the blame primarily on churches or pastors. Most of the pastors that I know of conservative-oriented churches, not the MAGA churches, are faithful. They're not particularly political, so they don't like giving sermons that are political. They don't like the church to be used as a political venue in any way. So they're almost intrinsically resistant to raising the issue of politics. And on top of that, they're afraid to raise the issue of politics, because if they do, even in the slightest way, this could cause ruptures within the congregation, splits within the church, splits within the governing bodies, the session, or whatever analogous group of overseers and elders and leaders that churches have. And they just don't want to do that. And then on top of that, there's the complication, which is, look, if I say anything on a given Sunday that is interpreted as political, then the following Sunday, if I'm speaking on Philippians 4, or John 1, then people just tune me out. They feel like, you're woke, you're an enemy of me on politics, therefore I don't trust your judgment on matters of, of faith. I do think in the longer term, what needs to happen is churches have to think through with care, and pastors and theologians, how did this happen? Because I think a lot of what is happening is that faith isn't nearly as essential to the life of a lot of Christians, and here I mean authentic Christians, as they like to think and as that pastors like to think. And I think folks in churches operate off of scripts. There's a certain vernacular, kind of Christianese that people talk about. And certainly if you're in Christian circles, whether it's a home group on Wednesday, or an adult education class on Sunday, or at church and during a church service, people speak about Jesus as if he is their all in all. And I, at those moments, I don't doubt them. So look, I've been in enough services to know when you see people, during worship songs, closing their eyes, lifting their arms, singing, they're longing to know Jesus, to have some sort of encounter with Jesus, and they may well be having that moment. But I also feel like that's a really short half-life. And it may be that by the time you get to Tuesday and the rest of the week, these people are in the right-wing echo chamber, and they're listening to the conflict entrepreneurs, and they're clicking on all sorts of sites and reading all sorts of things, and their emotions are getting inflamed. They're getting angry. They're getting wound up. And I think what happens is that's the main thing that's driving them. And then they're adding on Christianity to that because they want to sanctify those feelings, those emotions. They don't want to live with cognitive dissonance. They don't want to feel like I'm living at odds with what I really believe. So what they do is they justify their stance, find some verses to do the heavy work for them, and think, okay, I'm now acting the way I want to act because my emotions are inflamed, and now I've sort of baptized and sanctified those emotions and claimed that these are really being driven by a godly worldview. We're warriors. The progressives are the enemy. They're satanic figures. They want to do deep damage. This is a battle between children of light, children of darkness. I'm on the side of God. They're on the side of Satan. And this is about principalities and powers. So I just think it's very complicated. And to undo that, it requires, pastors and churches to think through with how do you educate the emotions and the passions, to use a Robert Bella phrase from years ago, the habits of the heart, and to find out how we fall in love with Jesus again, really fall in love with Jesus again. I think when that happens, when you see it in individual lives, that crowds out the other stuff. But if that's not real, if it's largely an affectation, even if you're not being cynical about it, there's a void. And I think politics is rushing in to fill that void. It creates a sense of community, sense of common enemy, sense of purpose. And that's what human beings long to have. And that goes for Christians too.
Yeah. And I think you're exactly right that a lot of pastors do not want to talk about politics from the pulpit. But I think a lot of them their hand is being forced. And here I'm not really talking about politics, but I'm talking about partisanship. And we should clarify. I mean, I think you're right that Erica Kirk, that was a presentation of the gospel we saw at the memorial service. But the conflict entrepreneurs we're talking about, one of them was Charlie Kirk. I mean, during the election, he was going around telling Christians, if your pastor does not endorse Donald Trump from the pulpit, then you should leave that church. So you have this MAGA Christianity that wants to force pastors into taking these political positions and partisan positions, I should say.
No, I think that's right. And Charlie Kirk said, you can't be a Christian and a Democrat and vote Democratic. I mean, he said a lot of things that I thought were problematic. Of course, his death was unbelievably tragic. I think his faith was authentic to him. I think he was wrong on a lot of stuff, but I don't think he was being, cynical about his faith. But you're right. There are people, certainly within the MAGA movement, but within churches themselves, who are really putting the screws to ministers to get on board, with Trump, to get on board with MAGA. And if pastors resist that, then they're going to be targeted. You saw that actually in the last few years of the life of Tim Keller, who was a wonderful, significant pastor and theologian. He was at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and it's probably the closest thing that Protestants had to a pope, in the 2000s, 2010s. But once Trump took the stage and there was the politicization, partisan grip that was happening within much of Christianity, you would see not infrequently people targeting Tim and sort of saying that his third wayism, as they referred to it, was weak, it was compromised, it was making peace with the secular world in a way that was not true to the gospel itself. So really, it was a situation in which being silent, being neutral from the pulpit, from the church, was not enough. They're now saying, from their perspective, given the stakes of the battle, you have to declare your allegiance to Trump and MAGA, because that's the side of Jesus, and you can't sit this one out. I think that's not only wrong, I think it's almost exactly opposite to what the reality is. And I'll tell you, man, one of my concerns about this moment is that you have a lot of significant figures within evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity speaking out, twinning Christianity and the MAGA movement and saying, that's who we are. That's who we represent. That's true of people like Eric Metaxas and Franklin Graham, and any number of Robert Jeffress, any number of others, Mike Huckabee, just go down the line for virtually forever. So they're making that case, and a watching world is looking at it and saying, okay, well, these people are claiming Trump and MAGA and the MAGA ethic as a Christian ethic, and I don't want anything to do with that. If that's the price of admission, count me out. And the people who don't believe that, who see things differently, almost to a person, are staying silent. So there's no counter narrative, even though it is more complex than that. And I know lots of evangelicals who were deeply troubled by the Trump moment and the MAGA moment. And here I'm speaking of pastors too, but they won't speak out for a variety of reasons. And what that does is create a false impression to a watching world, which says evangelical Christians are, absolutely on board with this. Now, the reality is that over 80%, as you know, voted for Donald Trump. So the majority are in his camp. But I do think it would be helpful from time to time if there were people, besides, David French and Russell Moore and myself and a few others who spoke out and said, this isn't us. But that's really not happening. And I've had hard talks with pastors. Like, at what point are you willing to speak out? What has to happen? Is there any line that Donald Trump can cross where you say enough, and that we need to say, you can't go there. This isn't us. And I've asked pastors too, do you regret that more white evangelical pastors didn't speak up during the civil rights struggle? And many of them say yes. And my response is, it'd be nice to be on the right side of history in real time rather than 50 or 60 years after the fact, after history has rendered its verdict, and then said, yeah, I wish the people back then stood for the right thing at the right moment, because that's what Christian ethics compelled us to do. But now, in the here and now, we're just going to be silent. We don't want to stir the waters. We don't want the hassles. We don't want the divisions. I understand all of that, but just know that that's coming at a great cost to the faith, not just to your own ministry or your own church.
Gosh, that's such an important point. I mean, yeah, if you're thinking to yourself, what would I have done during the civil rights era? What are you doing now? That's your answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you're right. We do need more pastors and ministry leaders to speak up. Earlier in this conversation, I caught myself about saying pastors being political and changed it to pastors being partisan. I think we need to make that distinction.
For sure.
We do need pastors talking about how our faith connects to our politics. That should be a topic in the church, in sermons. It's when you're connecting the faith to a partisan agenda, that's where it becomes a problem. And you're
Right.
letting the church become a tool for a political party. That's the problem. It's not talking about politics.
And I'd add one more thing to that, Nat, which is, I've heard any number of times ministers from the pulpit and others speak at churches on abortion and on homosexuality. So they have in their mind, there are a set of, it's not as if we're talking about virgins here, right? Churches never engage in politics. They do engage in politics. It's often selective, but they're willing to speak out. And why are they willing to speak out? One, they have been shaped by a certain evangelical subculture that's dictated to them what the issues that we should speak out about are and which are the ones we ought to be silent about. Secondly, they can speak on those issues and know that 98% of their congregation is going to be with them, so they're going to get support, not opposition, for speaking out. But if you're going to speak out on abortion or on homosexuality or on any number of other issues which churches have spoken out on, what about the destruction and dismantlization of the Global AIDS Initiative, PEPFAR, or the shuttering of USAID, and the catastrophic human consequences in the African continent? PEPFAR is a program that saved more than 25 million people since its inception in 2003. It was doing great good work, and now it's being destroyed. If the idea of caring for the least of these compels you to speak out on other issues, could you find a few moments to say something about that? If not, if not, why not? How do you decide which issues that you're going to speak out on? And I think that's an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people who are ministers, because it forces them to think through how we've gotten to the place we have.
Yeah, or just seeing the news and the videos out of Chicago of the apprehensions by Border Patrol and ICE agents. I am just constantly shocked at the lack of shock about
Right.
what's taking place in our country today.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So you worked during in the George W. Bush administration. At that time, I was doing my dissertation on the Christian right.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've been telling people and what I've written about in other places is the Christian right was different back then. It's not the same thing as it is today. Of course, this was before Turning Point, but Family Research Council was still around. That was back then. There is a shift that has occurred. There wasn't like this sort of anti-democratic and a lot of other things that's happened. Any thoughts, any impressions about why this shift has occurred in the Christian right, or do you agree that there has been a shift?
I do think there's been a shift. I'm not sure how profound it's been. I'd say it's more dramatic actually from the 90s than from the 80s. In the 80s, you had Jerry Falwell Sr., you had Pat Robertson. Those were two of the prominent spokespeople. Falwell started the Moral Majority. Robertson, the Christian Coalition, was followed by Ralph Reed. They were not anti-democratic in their instincts like you have now with MAGA, and they were not enemies of sort of classical liberalism, which we're seeing now. But the disposition, the sensibilities, the aggression, the almost the emanating hatred that you would see, that was there, at that time. I think in the 90s, early 2000s, it calmed down a bit, and evangelicals were somewhat helpful, I would say, when President George W. Bush, started PEPFAR, as I said, in 2003. But I think that there was a kind of recessive gene within Christians and evangelicals that's always been there. And I also happen to think that Christians are probably more susceptible to conspiracy theories than non-Christians are, for a variety of complicated reasons. And some of it is that there's a history of anti-science within Christianity. We see that's the 100th anniversary of the Scopes Monkey trial, but we've seen it in other ways too. I think that there was a lot of resentments and grievances that had been stored up and were percolating for decades. Some of them understandable, some of them certainly overstated, but that was happening. I think what happened was that Donald Trump, when he entered the scene in 2015, and of course in the primary in 2016, tapped into something that was pre-existing, and he began to lock in supporters, not the supporters, by the way, of the so-called establishment, Christian establishment, like the Family Research Council. Ted Cruz in 2016 was probably the choice of most of the establishment, right-wing Christian groups. But Trump understood something that the others didn't, and there was this grassroots movement that he tapped into. And I think, and this is an ugly side of Christianity, but I think it's true, what separated Trump from the others weren't policy positions, wasn't his history in the Republican Party, his history in the conservative movement, wasn't in his ability to articulate the pro-life case, wasn't any of that. It was his brutality. It was his cruelty. It was his crudity. That is what separated him from everybody else. And millions and millions and millions of Christians looked at that and said, that's the man we want. And this was not the binary choice between between Trump and Clinton. That came later. I'm talking about in the primary itself. Same thing happened in 2024. Nikki Haley was one of his challengers. That was a perfect opportunity for Christians to be able to say, look, she's polling better than he is against, at that time, Biden. She's a respected governor. She's more conservative on some issues than he is. She has a longer history in the Republican Party. She's younger. She's sharper, and she has none of the moral baggage or the cruelty. So here was a binary choice between two people on the right in the Republican Party, not between Trump and Biden or Trump and Kamala Harris. And again, in overwhelming numbers, Christians who proclaimed to be followers of Jesus looked at Donald Trump with an alternative, a viable alternative, and said, we're going with Trump. He's the personification of what we want. He represents what we want. His ethics are my ethics. And that means that something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. And for followers of Jesus to make that deal comes at an enormous cost to the Christian witness itself. And in the end, these people are violating integrity in any meaningful sense of the world. And then they've created a whole series of rationalizations to explain how they've done it. It's from a psychological perspective, you can detach yourself from all the harm that's being done, and that's hard to do. But if you can do that, it's really quite a fascinating insight into human psychology. And what you find out, Knapp, is that despite the proclamations of a lot of Christians, the gap between how Christians live their lives and the way non-Christians live their lives barely exists at all, if it exists at all. And that's its own show to talk about, because that itself is a puzzle, given that Christians are supposed to have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit within them. And one would presume that by that fact alone, there would be an enormous difference in the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, self-control, would be much more manifest in Christians than non-Christians. But I would say that's not the case. Doesn't mean, of course, there aren't exceptions. People whose lives have been transformed and who beautifully embody the Christian ethic and whose devotion to Jesus permeates their lives. But it's not nearly as widespread as I think one would hope, and one might even think were the case based on the Gospels and the epistles.
Yes, and so you're listening to the American Values Coalition podcast, where you can find more information at americanvalues.org. If you're a pastor who's interested in these topics, we also have a network, especially for you, called J29 Coalition. So you can find that at j29coalition.com. We've been talking about the Pete Wehner's article called Fully Magnified Christianity, which appeared in The Atlantic, published on September 29th, 2025. If you want to read more from Pete, there's two books I'd like to recommend to you. One is The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. And then there's an older book I'd like to recommend. It's called City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. This was co-written by our friend, the late Michael Gerson. Pete Wehner, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Knapp, and thanks for all you're doing and the witness that you've provided.